let me present myself. So I'm the team leader of fiscal policies here in INPA E1. I would also like to acknowledge Xavier Lemonnier in the session. He's the team leader of budget support. So in case we have specific questions later on, he can also step in. Thanks for joining, Xavier. So what I would like to present, I think we have a very broad, let's say, variety of colleagues in the call, some quite familiar with fiscal issues, some perhaps less familiar. So I really want to kind of take you a little bit from the basis, and then with the presentations of IMF, CEQ, and Oxfam will dive deeper into some of the specific issues. So in terms of, so I am now, how do I change the slide?
At the bottom left, when you move your mouse, you should see a little arrow.
Okay, it's good. Okay, thanks. So perhaps to start with, I wanted to kind of put a bit the framing in terms of international, let's say, commitments and kind of policy guidance we have on the topic of fiscal. Let's say there's different words actually used in framing the issue. Perhaps we start with the Address Inequality Action Agenda, who speaks about its commitment to enhancing revenue administration through modernized progressive tax systems. So here we have the idea of progressive improved tax policy and more efficient tax collection. As some of you may know, kind of as a follow-up to this and kind of appropriating it also for the let's say Commission and our policy in terms of development. We did a staff working document, let's say strategy called Collect More, Spend Better, and I think it's quite a telling name because it both looks at the collecting side, so the revenue side, and on the spending side, and we very much see those two aspects linked together, and which also need to be looked at together. We'll come to that in a minute. We are also committed under the Addis Tax Initiative, and here the commitment is to enhance DRM on the basis of equitable tax policy as well as efficient, effective, and transparent revenue administration. So again, let's say the efficiency dimension coming together with the equity dimension. And then more, let's say, internally, actually, it's quite interesting that the Commission President von der Leyen, in her very early policy or political statement and policy guidance, spoke about the kind of foundation of our social market economy and the dimension of everybody paying their fair share. So here the fairness also comes in. So perhaps before we dive into the basics, I wanted to give you a bit of a, let's say, a bigger historical dimension on the question of taxation. I mean, just to let's say put us back into it's basically very much linked to, let's say, states building. Taxation and state building are very much linked together. You see here a tax receipt from 174 before Christ of Egypt, and also the very famous Rosetta Stone, which actually has tax exemptions in 4 languages, and it's the stone which helped also decipher the hieroglyphs because there is the 4 languages. But just to give you this kind of very kind of historic dimension of taxation, I also quite liked being also in Belgium. Peter Bruegel the younger, and we referred about kind of efficient and effective tax administration. So this is his impression of the tax collector's office from 1640. So I guess there is some room for improvement in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. I also wanted to kind of point you to the historical moments such as the Boston Tea Party, kind of the birthplace of the USA as a nation, and kind of the link between taxation and representation. So we see that taxation is very much also, let's say, a crucial element into of kind of state building. And then I wanted to show you one slide which I found quite interesting. I mean, the whole book is interesting, a short history of equality of Thomas Piketty. And here on that slide, I mean, it's quite interesting where you see, let's say, taxation, I mean, the expansion of Europe, and the kind of, the linkages between expansion and also, let's say, the capacity to tax. And there you see quite an interesting kind of takeoff of some of the European nations at a crucial moment in history. Now, perhaps we go to more basic stuff to start with. I mean, I wanted to kind of highlight for those who are not, let's say, working on a daily basis with these issues. I mean, basically, the budget of a country is really kind of its policies put in numbers. And then, I mean, taxation is usually the main source of national revenue. So that's also clear. Taxes can be imposed on individuals, on legal entities, companies in particular. You can put taxes on income, consumption, property, wealth, and others. Already looking a little bit on the equity dimension, we mentioned before, it can be achieved on the collection side, as well as on the spending side, and that's why we should look at these two dimensions together and see the net fiscal system, which basically combines these two dimensions. And then I mean, the question of fairness. I mean, you have on the one hand the fairness considerations, but then obviously, and that's also, I think we heard in the very first slide, you always have also the efficiency and effectiveness dimension. So also this has to be looked at together. Then I think a very basic principle is also the ability to pay principle, and that is usually taken as the basis for, let's say, progressive tax systems. Then what is also very important is the distinction between direct and indirect taxation, because we'll be looking at that in terms of the question of also progressivity. Direct taxation are imposed on specific individuals or companies. So that would be an example would be personal income tax, company income tax, and property tax, for example, and indirect taxations which are imposed on transactions. So that, I think, was some important basics to start off the session. Now, let's look at how the European Commission, and in particular DG INTPA through headquarters, but more importantly through our delegations, can support equitable fiscal reform. So we mentioned already the collect more, spend better agenda as a kind of overall policy frame. Then I mean, usually what is very important is kind of to have a good, let's say, analysis to start with. And that can be both on the tax administration side, but also the tax policy side. I mean, on the tax administration side, we have the tool TADAT, Tax Administration Diagnostic Assessment Tool, which looks very much at efficiency and effectiveness of tax administrations. And then we will hear more about fiscal incidence analysis, which will look more at tax policy side and also the kind of equity dimension of it. In terms of capacity development, I mean, we are working with international partners. We're working with the IMF. We're also working with OECD, but also with technical assistance providers, let's say, contracted directly by delegations. IX and twinnings are also possibilities to have a more, let's say, peer-to-peer learning process between delegations between member states and administrations in partner countries. Policy dialogue, very much linked to budget support, is a very important dimension. Budget support, we have the general conditions which have the progress of PFM and DRM reform as a general condition, but then we can incentivize specific aspects of reforms through variable tranche indicators. So I think we always have to, especially in countries where we have budget support, we have to think of these dimensions together: technical assistance, policy dialogue, and budget support in fixed tranche and variable tranche. We also have the possibility to support civil society, the capacity of civil society to actually analyze and engage in the policy discussions through call for proposals. In some countries, we have also worked with the parliament, so it can better play its role in terms of its oversight function and influencing the policy debate and the legislative progress. I mean, the equity dimension, you can look at it from within a country, but you can also look at it between countries, and that's where the tax avoidance and tax evasion agenda is coming in. We won't go into detail, but I wanted to mention it also as a additional aspect. Perhaps a couple of words on the inequalities aspects on the revenue side. Again, things are usually much more complicated, and we'll hear more about that later, but just as a kind of some general statements here. So usually, I mean, focus on raising tax effort in countries where it is found to be low is important. Then the question we heard about direct taxations, and then on the other hand, the transfers, which can have more targeted individual effects than indirect taxation, such as VAT, if we look now at the revenue side. Then the question of enhanced progressivity. I mean, on the one hand, you can achieve that through expansion of the tax base, so who is taxed, as well as raising tax rates. So also there you have to find a balance between the two, but definitely both should be analyzed and looked at. One should avoid regressive indirect tax exemptions. So that's basically, looking at tax exemptions which then profit basically essentially those who need it least. Let's put it that way. We already heard about the international tax cooperation on tax evasion, tax avoidance. I mean, this is very much linked to what we do with the OECD, or where the OECD is in the lead in terms of what is called BEPS, the base erosion and profit shifting agenda, as well as the Global Forum, which looks at changing information and having more tax transparency and helping thereby countries to actually know what people are paying in other countries so that they can better tax them in their own country. I mean, very often kind of as a basic issue, I mean, this is not, let's say, taxation in the let's say in the strict sense, but very often a prerequisite is the question of cadastral service and property registration, which is a prerequisite, especially in respect to property taxes. So then looking a little bit on the expenditure side for some avenues there. So obviously the question of the spending for social sectors, health, education, social protection, and basic infrastructure is important in terms of I mean reaching and providing services also for the lower 40%, and then more directly social transfers, social assistance, but also unemployment insurance. The question of conditional cash transfer, so that could be, for example, linked to you know, school attendance or similar. And then having a critical look at subsidies, both subsidies and tax expenditure, actually, which is kind of two sides of the same medal, is important. And then obviously the whole question of spending efficiency. I mean, there is a study by the IMF, which I think has put kind of potential gains in efficiency on public investment policy of around 40% in developing countries. So I mean, let's see, those efficiency gains can obviously then help to increase the overall share of the cake to be used also for social spending, for example. Now, looking perhaps also a bit on the wider dimension of equity. I mean, there's obviously the question of gender, this question of inclusiveness for disabilities, vulnerable groups, kind of regional disparities. So I mean, what we usually did once a year is the budget support trends and results, where we also give examples or want to showcase how this is done through budget support. So I think here you can see a couple of examples, very concrete examples of what has been achieved in those areas in different parts of the world. And then we will, I think there will be a session on Thursday on social protection. So I will not go so much into detail on that, but still wanted to complete the presentation also with that dimension, because we also believe that budget support can be an effective tool to look at social protection and to support social protection at different levels, depending on the country, depending if it doesn't exist at all, where it needs an upgrade. Different approaches can be used. Here again, you see a couple of examples: Paraguay, Rwanda, Senegal, and others, where we have worked in that area through budget support. Some entry points. I mean, the financing is obviously a key dimension, but also the question of targeting. So I mean, you will follow that also in the national debates, that targeting is always a big issue, and that can be also part of the debate. This question of sequences is also important. I mean, as it is for public finance management reform as such, it is also very important in terms of social protection reform, efficiency, accountability, and very often the question of, let's say, lack of coordination between ministries, which can be improved. Yeah, let me stop here as a kind of first intro. We also have prepared a little kind of let's say quiz for you, So may I ask that quiz to be, I mean, this is working through the house space, I guess, but perhaps Jérôme, you can take over and quickly explain the voting mechanism in that quiz. Thanks.
Sure. Good morning again, everyone. You should see my screen now. If you look at the chat in your Zoom, you should find a link that takes you straight to the house space page, where you will find the session Fiscal Policies opened. And the first thing you will see is this little button to join the meeting where you're already in. And a little bit below, question for presentations. And if you keep on scrolling down, you will find the quiz. And I hope you're all able to see that on my screen. Which I should believe so, but let us know. The question is, which of the following taxes or spending would you expect to be either regressive, mark 1, progressive, mark 3, when you think it depends of how it's designed, defined, or the context, mark 2 as it depends. And you just have to use the cursor here that you can move as you please on each or any of these. Obviously, these answers I'm showing you are not any reflection of realities. So I'm going to move back my cursors and let you move yours, and we'll display the answers and have a quick chat with Benedict on those answers. I hope you're all able to do so. If you can put up your fingers up on your Zoom to let us know it's all okay. And as we're going to move for a quick chat and discussion on this, if you can put back your cameras on. Excellent. I see some fingers, so it seems to be working. It'd be great that as many of you are able to do so, because it would give this little survey a lot more content and purpose. So please do try to answer. Yes, I should remind you that it's all anonymous. We're not tracking your IP addresses. So
don't forget to put on submit at the end.
Yes, you have to click on submit indeed here at the end. But I think I have to display the
exactly, Jérôme. Maybe I can give you. You can do that on the 3 dots and then show latest round results. The one in the middle, the latest round results.
Okay, so I don't know if giving it another minute for answers or 30 seconds. How many answers do we have by now?
Around 25.
Okay, so if you keep on pushing, because that's about half of the room, we are 16 in the room. So if you can keep on trying to answer and click on submit, we'll be very grateful. And then I'll show the results.
Can you choose the other one, please, for us, Jérôme? The latest ones.
Sorry.
No problem.
That's the one.
Then we get the better graph.
That's
Exactly.
it. Much nicer. Good. It will keep on changing and you keep answering. Benedict, and obviously whoever else would like to have a quick comment on those answers.
Right. Yeah, we won't go into them in detail, but just let's say very quickly. I mean, obviously, very often it depends. I mean, usually property tax we would associate with being progressive in terms of more wealthy people having more property. So that's the usual, but obviously it depends if you just do it on the basis of the entity and not let's say the value. It could be different, but it's usually considered progressive. Income tax in our let's say European context also usually considered progressive, but obviously also devil lies in the detail. Yeah, VAT. There's also a different analysis. I mean, often considered regressive, but for example, if there is a very big informal sector and then only people in the formal economy actually paid, it can also be a little bit different. Well, with cash transfers, it very much depends on how targeted it is, but it can be something rather progressive if well targeted. Expenditure on universal primary health care. Yeah, I think here we see quite a tendency towards progressive. I think that's shared. Fuel subsidies, it's a tricky one. Yeah, we see quite regressive. I mean, especially in countries where only rich people have cars, it can have quite a regressive. On the other hand, it's also quite an emotional topic in terms of public transport, etc. So, but I think here, I think the trend towards regressive is quite understandable. I mean, the last one is a bit of a tricky one. I mean, because on the one hand, you know, that's why actually I put it, you know, I mean, when we see, I mean, the comparison between primary education and tertiary education, if the let's say structure is such that it's actually mainly rich people going to university, it can actually be rather regressive. But then again, it depends. But I mean, we'll hear much more detail on this by also our experts. And I think they will also confirm that very often it is the it depends. But I just wanted to get us thinking a little bit about kind of some dimensions there and kind of take this as a start for the following sessions. With this, thanks a lot, and looking forward both to the presentations and then the rejoining for the panel discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Benedict, and thanks for this quick survey. Very interesting indeed. And thanks for pointing the it depends. It depends of how the revenue administration works. It depends of the share of those revenues in overall composition of revenues of the states, and a few more elements of contextual aspects in the structure of the economy indeed. Without more delays, let me welcome back again Brooks Evans and Charles Velutini from the IMF Fiscal Department. They're both senior economists there. They will come to us present on the IMF research and papers and how taxation and spending can have make a dent to inequalities.
Very good. Should I start now?
Please.
Thank you very much, Jerome and Benedict, and to the organizers. My name is Brooks Evans. I'm a senior economist at the International Monetary Fund, where I focus on fiscal issues and in particular on expenditure policy. I'm joined by my colleague, Charles Velutini, who is from the tax policy division, and we'll be talking more about taxation issues. So I'm going to start by providing an overall overview of the effects of recent shocks. There have been many in the last few years, and how these have impacted inequality and how fiscal policy can play a role in ameliorating these in terms of inequality effects. The first is the COVID-19 pandemic, which unfortunately we're still in. This presented here two charts, one on the left-hand side, which is looking at longer-term scarring effects. So not just one-off effects, for example, lost income in 1 year. And on the right-hand side is looking at the poverty impact. Starting on the left-hand side, you can see the lost schooling, and it's on the leftmost part of this is for advanced economies, and on the right is for emerging market economies. And it's has overall closure days on the furthest left, and then by quintile. And then there are both dark bars, which is for low education parents, and then lighter bars, which is for higher education parents. So I'm going to look at emerging market economies on this rightermost part. And what you can see compared to advanced economies, that the loss of school days was much larger than advanced economies. And you can see that as you move from the bottom to the bottom poorest to the richest part of the distribution, that the poorest quintiles were hit the hardest in terms of lost schooling days. And furthermore, you can see with these dark bars that the lower educated parents, their children were impacted the most. And then as you move up the income distribution, the effect of lost schooling is less. And you can see the composition change where there are generally, due to the relationship of education and income, it's a bit more balanced in terms of the impact. The key takeaway here is COVID-19 didn't only lead to a one-off impact in terms of lost education, but this has a longer-term impact. As we all know, the returns to schooling is very much linked with future income and a number of other effects, such as for health and other human capital formulation. On the right-hand side is looking at the impact of the pandemic in terms of the extreme poverty line. So this is the World Bank $1.90 per day. And you can see from 1995, a very sizable and substantial downward trend of the extreme poverty rate worldwide. So you can see as we go down, and then once the pandemic hits, we had the current projection, and you can see on the furthest right-hand side has a bit of a zoom in, so you can see it better. That the baseline, had there not been a pandemic, was to have this trend more or less continue in a downward fashion. However, due to the pandemic, there was a uptick in 2020, and there's still a gap of roughly 70 million additional people living worldwide in extreme poverty. So key takeaways from this slide is that the pandemic has had a distributional effect, both from a scarring effect on lost schooling and future returns to education and income. And that particularly affects the bottom of the income distribution. And further, that there has been a substantial increase in poverty worldwide as a result. Now, the next shock, looking at the war in Ukraine, that has had a very major impact on both food and fuel inflation. So this is a shock upon a shock that has further put pressure on governments, companies, and on households. This is basically showing how the inflation shock has affected the distribution. On the left-hand side is Kenya, and we'll focus on Colombia on the right-hand side. Again, we have the poorest to the richest quintiles, the poorest on the left-hand side, the richest on the right-hand side. We can see in Colombia, the inflation was roughly 9 or almost 10%. And as you move from the poorest to the richest to the distribution, the inflationary impact was roughly 10% for the poorest quintile, where it was roughly 8% for the richest quintile. So you see a magnitude effect where inflation more impacts the poor. And further, we have a decomposition of which categories were experiencing the most inflation. So the first most prominent is in blue, which is for food and non-alcoholic beverages, which represented roughly 6% of 60% of the inflationary impact for the poorest quintile. And then we have in orange, the energy component, which is about 2%, apologies, 20% of the entire inflationary impact on the bottom quintile. Looking just for contrast, you can see the richest quintile, again, the bar is much lower. You can see the food share and energy shares are much smaller. Key takeaways from this slide are, we saw before, the COVID-19 pandemic had scarring and poverty effects. And now we have the inflationary distributional effects that are most disproportionately affecting the bottom of the income distribution vis-a-vis food and fuel inflation. Looking at the different immediate channels of inflation on fiscal policy, I'm going to focus primarily on expenditure, as my colleague will focus on tax policy. So looking at primary expenditure, so these are things, for example, look at the pre-distribution as well as the redistribution of fiscal policy. The pre-distribution more or less refers to policies that will affect future income inequality. And these, some of the main categories are education, which I've discussed on the first slide, and also health policy. So these are things that impact the future income inequality, or can help to lessen that. And also redistribution, which includes taxes and transfers. So what has this, the channels of this, these various shocks had, and in particular, the inflationary shock that we've seen over the last year or so, is that there are a lot of spending items, for example, pensions, social benefits, public salaries, they're indexed to varying degrees from low income to advanced economies, which put additional spending pressures on government. Additionally, that has an impact on debt service and interest rate bills. I won't go into everything else. There's a time constraint, so I'll move on. So focusing on the IMF work on inequality, we have three components. The first is what we call surveillance, which is basically our day-to-day monitoring of all of our member countries, which is more or less every country in the world. And there's been very much an increased focus on inequality and distributional issues even before the pandemic. As you can see in Figure 1, this is the analytical work appearing in IMF Article 4 staff reports. For those who are not familiar with Article 4s, these are more or less our annual assessments of the economic and social conditions of the country. And you can see on the left-hand side in blue are advanced economies, in the middle are emerging market economies, and on the right-hand side are low-income developing countries. And you can just see from the various bars, the different areas that we've focused on. A major area has been social spending. So again, health, education, social protection. There's been a large focus on inequality, trends, drivers, and policies, and more recently, gender inequality. You can see within the different income groupings, there's a bit of a compositional differentiation for this. The key takeaway from this slide is that we are extremely engaged even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And not only are we engaged in all components of our work, from day-to-day surveillance to our lending operations, either for concessional below market rates or non-interest rate programs with countries or funding arrangements. And then finally for capacity development, where we work with member countries to provide training and other technical assistance. With that, I will switch to my colleague, Charles. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooks. So let's look at the tax policies now, and Benedict's introduction is very nice because we're going to save time on some definitions here and concepts. So we look at the redistributive capacity of tax policies, and let me start by clarifying a few concepts, and we use this concept a lot in our research and our technical assistance to our membership. So if we look at the next slide. Thank you, Brooks. So what is about redistribution and progressivity? So let's first define one very important concept, which is redistributive capacity. And this is really what matters, what we want to achieve with when we look at tax policy and about how we can reduce inequality. This is simply the difference of the Gini coefficients of the pre-tax income with the post-tax income. Okay, we just take the difference of the Ginis, and this is what most researchers and most people do when we look at redistribution achieved by tax policies. Now, the interesting thing, and again, we do use that a lot in technical assistance, is that this redistributive capacity can be decomposed into two components. The first component is what we call the size of policy, which is simply the amount of collection by taxation over the tax base. Think of, for example, if you think of the PIT, the personal income tax, think of the tax ratio. I mean, the collection of PIT over GDP, for example. That's the size, how much you collect. Okay. And then you have the progressivity per se, which we call here progressive capacity, which is the difference between the Gini coefficient of taxes themselves and the Gini of the pre-tax income. And here the intuition is that if the taxes are very concentrated on the high income, right? If you have a high Gini on taxes, then you will have more progressive tax system and PIT in that case. So combining the two is going to lead to R, the redistribution capacity. So here the key message is that, for a PIT, any tax system, being progressive is not enough. It is often a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. Size matters, and it matters a lot. And we're going to illustrate that. Next slide, please, Brooks. With very general statistics on precisely the three concepts I just discussed. Going back to, yes, thank you, Brooks. Progressive capacity is here shown over time in three country groups: advanced economies, emerging markets, and developing countries. So let's look at progressivity first. The upper left panel here, and it's interesting to see that in many developing countries, and that would be, even though it's small, it would be your blue line, the one on the top. In fact, you will see that you do have a lot of progressivity in the PIT in many developing countries. On the other hand, emerging countries, and especially over the last period, have been declining in terms of progressivity, because you have, for example, many instances of flat rate PIT in this group of countries. And interestingly, in advanced economies, the one in green, it is quite low. Progressivity is actually low, as we just defined it. Now, if we look at the next chart, the one upper right this time, which is the aggregate tax rate, which we called before the size, right, of PIT in these country groups. Well, one thing would immediately jumps up is that in advanced economies, the size as measured by the aggregate tax rate of PIT is much larger, right? So you have bigger policies there, and as a result, and that's the chart on the bottom of the slide here, you will see that what is achieved in actual redistribution in advanced economies is much larger, right? That's the green line on top, and unfortunately, in spite of the progressive nature of the PIT in developing countries, little or relatively little redistribution is achieved in this country group. So again, higher progressivity does not imply a greater redistributive capacity. Okay, the size of the PIT matters. It's a little bit like Benedict alluded to, I think, when we refer to base broadening. I mean, you need to increase the size of the PIT to achieve substantial redistribution. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to talk about the influence of natural resources. It's a very, very important topic in many of the countries we work with, in developing areas, but also in emerging areas. The first thing that needs to be noted, this is well known, we see that a lot, but it's nevertheless very important. There is a negative association between the presence of natural resources, think of mining, think of oil and gas a lot. So the more a country tends to collect from natural resources, the less it will collect from standard tax instruments, also the VAT and PIT particularly. So there is this negative association. It's not, of course, it's just an association. It's not mechanically the case everywhere, but you do have that negative correlation. So this is shown here on the upper left graph with the little red square. You see in advanced economies, you do have a lower dependency on natural resources, whereas in developing countries and in emerging markets, you depend more. And the blue bar here shows that the marginal effect of natural resources revenue on tax revenue is actually slightly negative, and it's especially in developing countries. So you have that message that many countries tend to tax less when they have more revenue. It's like a crowding out effect a little bit. Okay. Now, if you look at how this translates in terms of PIT revenue, and we know that PIT, the personal income tax, matters a lot for redistribution. Okay. And if we focus a little bit on MENA and Central Asian countries here, you see that it's no surprise that in exporters of oil and gas, PIT revenue is actually very small. Some countries don't have a PIT at all, right? And as a result, the redistributive capacity in those countries of the PIT tends to be lower, right? It's because they collect less, simply. So that's important, right? Right now, the situation is that in the more natural resources revenue a country has, the less it tends to redistribute through its tax system. Now, that being said, let's not forget about expenditures. I'm talking about taxes here, tax policy, but of course, a country that collects a lot of revenue for natural resources can choose to spend them in a redistributive way, which is perfectly important to bear in mind. This is not what is discussed here, but nevertheless should be borne in mind. Let's move to another aspect now of tax policy and redistribution. Brooks, please. Thank you. Up to now, we've been talking about static effects, no influence of the tax system on the behavior of taxpayers and labor suppliers of labors. Now let's focus a little bit on a region we work a lot with, the Western Balkans, which is a very nice example of situations that you find elsewhere. Whereas the labor tax wedge, what is the tax wedge? A brief definition: it's a difference between the cost of labor for the employer and the take-home pay received by the employee. Okay, that's a tax wedge. That's the taxes, the social security contribution in the middle. Okay, so the message here is that in that region, there is not a lot of progressivity in the tax wedge. So if we look at the left-hand side graph here, on the horizontal axis, we have the labor tax wedge, right? It is measured in percentage, starting from 0 to up to 60% here. And on the vertical axis, we just have a list of countries, right? And what is interesting is we do that, we compute that labor tax wedge for 3 levels of income. Below the average, 67% of the average, 100%, and a higher income level, which is 167%. And what's interesting is you have these 3 little dots for the 3 levels of income, and for countries like North Macedonia and others, you see that the dots are actually clustered together. So you don't have a lot of progressivity here. That means that you do have high tax wedge on the lower income segment of the distribution. And in some cases, it's even actually worse. If you look at Albania and North Macedonia, on the right-hand side of the slide here, you see that for the very lower end of the income distribution, you actually have a higher tax wedge, which is clearly going to discourage entry into the the formal labor market, right? So this is creating, an actual the contrary of redistribution, right? And why is that? Because in those 2 examples, Albania and North Macedonia, but it's a very common situation. In fact, you have minima, you have minimal amount of social security contributions you need to pay. So you see here, SIC is in fact social insurance contributions. We call it also social security contributions. So you have a minimal amount of those you need to pay regardless of the amount of your income, and this is profoundly creating a situation of inequality on the labor market, and has some real effect, in dynamic effect on the behavior of people, and it's not benefiting the lower end of the distribution. Let me stop here. We'll be happy, my colleague Brooks and I, to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brooks and Charles. This is very, very interesting and very well illustrated with all of your graphs. I mean, the AMF has developed a keen sense of visual representation of all of what you present to us. So that's very nice. Thank you. For the questions and answers, we'll go to the panel session at the end of all of the presentations. So please hold on with your questions or start posting them if you wish on the website. I would like now to move to our second guest speakers, Ms. Maya Goldman, the associate researcher at Commitment to Equality of Tulane University. Maya, welcome.
Thank you.
So I think you'll tell us about tax incidents and spending policy incidents and how you use that at CEQ to suggest policy reforms. So yes. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. And I'm lucky in that I've had lots of nice introductions to this morning. So hopefully that will feed in nicely into the presentation. So yeah, so my name is Maya Goldman. I'm a research associate at CEQ. I'm also a consultant at the World Bank Equity Poverty Lab and a research and use fellow at the Global Development Network on research uptake of fiscal incidence analysis. And brief overview, I'm going to talk about what is the Commitment to Equity Institute. I'll give you a very brief introduction to the methodology, the kind of backbone or framework of the methodology. I'll discuss a couple of main findings. And I'll just very briefly mention the work that GDN is doing on enhancing the policy impacts or the research uptake of this FIA evidence. I probably won't get to the policy impacts now in this presentation, and we'll probably discuss them more in the panel discussion, but we'll see how we go. Yeah, okay. So what is the Commitment to Equity Institute? The mission of the CEQ Institute is to reduce inequality and poverty. And they aim to do that through tax and benefit incidence analysis, as you've heard. And what do we mean by tax and benefit incidence analysis? We look at what is the burden and that individuals experience or households experience, and what are the benefits that they experience through tax collection or through spending from government. And also, and so we look at how each of the different kind of tax instruments and policy instruments of government affect inequality and affect poverty. And we then use these assessments and this information to engage with the policy community to look at how we might be able to improve policy or the overall impact of the system on poverty and inequality. So the objective of the Institute specifically is to measure the impact of fiscal policy on inequality and on poverty across the world and using a comparable framework. So the assessment is a diagnostic tool, and it can be used for monitoring purposes, but it can also importantly be used as a framework for policy simulations. It's often a very useful tool for decision making. You can nicely see with the CEQ simulations exactly what the impact of one policy change might be on the system as a whole. So the main functions of the CEQ Institute at this time are sort of enhancements of the overall methodology, and they maintain a data center, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And because most of their funding has kind of historically come from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, pretty much everything they do is open source and freely available online. So there is a free version of the CEQ handbook, which you will be able to access when you get these slides, and you'll be able to look online and see exactly. Just a warning, it's very large and technical. I'm going to quickly share what happens if you click on this link here, and this will take you to the homepage of the CEQ Institute. And you have here this interactive map, which allows you to see all of the countries that have been assessed thus far. And you can either click on one of these countries, or you can click on one of the names on the right here, and that will take you to the list of publications of that country. So all the CEQ assessments that have been done, also if we've done sort of contributed to one of the IMF papers or to a World Bank PR, they will be included here as well, linked. And also any cross-country analysis that's been done that includes this country. And you can also go to the CEQ data center, and you can download a very large Excel spreadsheet with all of the results of all of the different countries, about 70 different countries that have been worked on. Okay, so let me just go back to my presentation. So there've been assessments on roughly 80 countries thus far, with all the results freely available in the data center. CEQ has about 100 different collaborators and a number of non-resident research associates, and they collaborate with multiple organizations, the ADB, the AFD, the European Commission, GDN, the IDB, IMF, and the list goes on. And they have a working paper series and numerous scholarly publications where they put out all of the work that they do. So CEQ methodology at a glance. The way that the CEQ framework works is it starts from private income. So let me get my pointer up here. So you can see here, this is kind of an aggregate of various different private income sources. So it's a combination of income from earnings, income from any capital investments you might have, income from rent, any rental properties that you might have. And that's all aggregated up here into what we call kind of pre-fiscal or market income, everything that's private. And what we do is we then add and we subtract different layers of public taxes and transfers until we can account for as many fiscal policy instruments as possible. And we can then measure poverty and inequality at the different points in the system. So I have to go, there we go. So if we subtract if we subtract direct taxes from this aggregate of private income, we get to this concept that we call net market income, obviously, right? Net of direct taxes. And as many of my colleagues have explained, direct taxes here, we mean personal income tax, we mean payroll taxes, we mean property taxes. So when we get to net market income, we can then add in direct transfers like school canteen, cash transfers for children, foster grants, and that will give us a measure which we call our disposable income. So that's everything that a household has at its disposal to spend, right? But of what we spend, we don't get to consume everything. And the reason for that is because we have certain taxes that are coming off what we spend, right? Consumption taxes. And we also have certain subsidies, which are sort of increasing the consumption value of what we spend. So if we subtract these indirect taxes like VAT, customs, excise, and fuel, and if we add in these indirect subsidies like electricity and water, then we'll get to our consumable income, what we're actually able to consume of the income that we spend. And we can then add in, finally, the in-kind benefits from sort of education and health spending, and subtract off any user fees to get to what we call our final income. So at CEQ, differently to what Charles has just so nicely presented, we have a kind of a different measure of redistribution, which we call the total redistributive effect. In contrast to what he presented, which was, I believe, was the redistributive capacity, which looks at purely the tax side. Here we look at what is the difference between this private income aggregate and then the income aggregate once we've added in and subtracted all of these different fiscal instruments. And so that gives us what we call the total redistributive effect. So the difference in inequality before and after government intervention. Okay. So some of the benefits of the CEQ methodology: it's widely accepted, it's rigorous, and it's standardized. It's designed for developing countries, so it takes informality into account. And as kind of Benedict hinted a little bit earlier, that can be quite important when we look at the impact of, say, for example, the VAT. If we look at a VAT without informality, it will look neutral, perhaps even slightly regressive. If we take informality into account, it can actually become progressive. The CEQ framework can assess the distributional impacts of the whole system, as well as a wide range of fiscal interventions on their own. Now, why is that so important? Again, as kind of Charles mentioned briefly earlier, if we look just at the tax impact, we might it might look like a tax is regressive and it's impoverishing. But if we can take into account what that tax is used to fund, we might be able to see that the tax is being used to fund a highly progressive transfer system, which actually means that the system as a whole ends up being very progressive. So it's very important to be able to look at the whole system. In addition, the standardization of the CEQ allows for this comparability and this cross-country analysis. And often that's really useful for policymakers when they kind of just look at kind of, okay, yes, the Gini is reduced by this when we add in a personal income tax, that might not mean much. But if we then compare it with other countries in the region, it often becomes a lot more they're a lot easier for them to digest and understand. Finally, it's a useful framework, as I mentioned, to start thinking about policy simulations. So once we have mapped the kind of the baseline system, it's then very easy to say, okay, what happens if we change now some of the rates in the personal income tax? What will happen if we increase the rate of the VAT? How will that impact overall poverty in the country? Of course, like any model, there are a number of limitations as well. And the biggest one is that it doesn't have any general equilibrium effects. So this can make the model simpler and easier for people to understand. And it means that we can be quite sure of the impact that we model. But obviously that can be very important. So if you increase the rates of a PIT, we know that the amount of tax that we collect from that will be very different if we increase the rates on a VAT, given that people are much more likely to resort to tax evasion in a more progressive, less broad-based tax than they are in a more broad-based tax, for example. So this can be quite important and is very, needs to be kind of understood along with, framed along with any of the results that come out of a CEQ. It's a point in time accounting approach. So we can't look at things like the trade-off between what happens if we spend on infrastructure and that increases economic growth and there's more employment versus what happens now if we spend on a cash transfer and we reduce poverty. We can't look at the differences between those, and we also can't look at the role of pensions in an intertemporal framework, which is quite important, obviously, right? Because we it'd be nice to be able to say, okay, if I spend this money on a pension now, how will I be impoverished, or how will I be benefited later on when I receive that pension? We can't do it. All we can look at is how much do pension recipients receive now, and how much do pension contributors receive now at this one point in time. Another big limitation is that we value in-kind education and health benefits at an average cost of provision. So as Brooks mentioned, we all know education is really important for reducing inequality and for future income gains. In a CQ, we can't look at future income gains. We look at how much does government spend and how is that spending distributed amongst the population. Finally, it excludes important categories of taxes and spending. So we always have to be careful when we're kind of framing the CQ results. As I'll explain briefly now, sometimes their poverty increasing, sometimes it shows that fiscal policy increases poverty. And it can be important to then frame that and to explain that that's because we don't take into account spending on infrastructure, and we don't take into account spending on other things which might actually be having an effect on poverty, but of course we can't measure that. Okay, so that's a brief intro to the methodology. In terms of the main findings, as I mentioned, one of the things that can often be quite confusing when people first see a CEQ is that fiscal policy is always inequality reducing from what we've seen so far, but it can be poverty increasing at the same time as being inequality reducing. So how can that work? So here you see a graph of the total impact of fiscal policy on inequality. So if we remember that framework that I just showed, this is the difference between private income before government intervention and income after government intervention. And a larger bar means that we're reducing inequality. So you can see for all the countries in the database here, there's inequality reduction happening. But if we look at the poverty impact, we can see that sometimes they're poverty reducing, a positive bar, and sometimes they are poverty increasing with a negative bar. So how is it that we can be reducing inequality but increasing poverty? If you look at the graph here that shows, so we have disposable income of each decile from 1 to 10. And here we've normalized this by disposable income, this graph. So it's 1 for everybody, disposable income. We can subtract off the indirect taxes. And we see here that indirect taxes are relatively flat, as we would expect, and slightly impoverishing for people in the poorer deciles. Now we can reduce inequality, of course, by taking income from the top with these direct taxes, right? And that's the income tax, the payroll taxes. We can see that they're much higher for the richer deciles than they are for the poorer deciles. But we can also reduce inequality by giving income to people at the bottom. And that's what happens when we add in the social grants into the system. And we see that once we add in the social grants, they are larger than the impact of the indirect taxes and the direct taxes in this case. And this graph actually comes from South Africa. So with a substantial social grant system, you outweigh the impoverishing effects of your indirect taxes. So this shows again the importance of looking at the system as a whole. If you have these indirect taxes, but you don't include the social grants, you're going to end up impoverishing your population, but you may still be reducing inequality with your direct tax system. Okay. A second important finding of the CEQ is that the way we treat pensions matters a lot. So we can think of pensions as a government transfer, a tool for redistribution, which it is more in some countries than in others, or we can treat it as a forced savings. So I will put in certain money, but I will get out that money at the end, exactly the same amount that I put in. It's forced savings. There's no redistribution happening, right? Now, assumptions about contributory pensions make a big difference in countries that have large social security systems and a high proportion of retirees. So if we look at this inequality reduction graph, you can see that there's a blue scenario and a green scenario, where the blue scenario is where we treat pensions as savings or deferred income, and the green scenario is we treat pensions as a government transfer. And the impact on inequality reduction for certain countries is much greater in the case where we treat pensions as a government transfer. So the CEQ tends to model pensions both ways. Neither is usually perfect. It's usually some mix of the two, but one might be more appropriate than another, depending on the region that you're working in. A final finding that we have, and I realize I'm reaching the end of my 15 minutes already, is that more social spending doesn't necessarily equal more redistribution. And again, I think Benedict highlighted this earlier. So particularly when it comes to something like primary education, for example, we know that primary education is often very pro-poor, whereas tertiary education spending, particularly in a country like South Africa, for example, which is where I come from, it's only slightly more progressive than income, or perhaps regressive in the case where only those who are already relatively rich manage to make it through primary and secondary education to get to a level where they can even benefit from tertiary education spending. So this sort of concentration curves shows very clearly, you can see that the line of perfect equality running along the middle here, let me get my pointer back, and anything above here is a pro-poor expenditure. So spending on primary school and secondary is very pro-poor. Anything below is progressive, but not pro-poor. And anything below the Lorenz curve would be actually regressive. So in this case, we see it's not regressive, but it's much less progressive. The tertiary education is this one in teal here. College education is in brown, and these are much less progressive than the spending on primary and secondary education, for example. So I'm going to skip the policy impacts and keep them for the panel discussion because we've reached the end of my time, but I will just briefly mention that GDN is doing work on enhancing policy uptake. And so we have a number of kind of barriers to impact that we've noted at GDN, and also ways in which we believe that we can enhance the policy uptake of the CEQ, and I'll hopefully have a chance to discuss that more in the panel. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for this amazing presentation, Maya. Very interesting and great findings. Surely there'll be policy impacts that you want to discuss at some point, even during the Q&A, or maybe you will share your presentation and we can post it online for participants. And surely we can contact you for questions later on. Very, very passionating. So without further delay, we need to also ask our colleagues from civil society at Oxfam to let us know how they view their role and how they can also influence fiscal policies and their incidence on inequalities. Perhaps Kwesi Obeng from Oxfam, based in Ghana, will take the floor. We don't hear you yet. Kwesi, you have to put back your microphone on. Nope, we don't hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, can you see my screen?
Yes, but you are in a presenter mode. You may have to change that back to the full screen mode.
Right, so let's go.
You can go in display settings and change it from there.
Okay, so let's go back.
And while we wait for Kwesi to share, you can all post questions in the chat on the HouseSpace platform, and we'll look at it during the Q&A session after the presentation by Mr. Obeng. But should we?
Yeah.
You're okay to take it up? Or do you want us to take the lead for you?
I can share my screen if it's needed.
I think we've lost Mr. Obeng. Yeah. So if we don't get Mr. Obeng back soon, we may have to. Okay. I think Mr. Obeng was disconnected. I'm not sure it will reconnect fast. It all depends on how the connection will work back in Accra. So what I suggest here, if you agree to that, Benedict, we may start the Q&A panel. Oh, Mr. Bank is back, so let's see if it works now. Okay. Can you hear us, Kwesi?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Oh, great. So we'll let you take the floor if you can share your screen, or shall we share the screen for you and present the slides?
Let me just share from here.
Okay.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. So apologies, by the way. I'm not sure why it froze momentarily, but thanks very much. And it's very interesting. And I see quite a number of convergences, particularly with, is it Maya's presentation? Anyway, so I'm from Oxfam, West Africa, the regional advisor, and I'm based in Accra. So this is just quickly the outline of my presentation. I'll try and speak briefly about inequality and tax globally, and then zoom into West Africa and look at some case studies from the region. And if there's time, I would speak about both the outcomes, but then also the process, because I think both are important and complementary. And so, of course, we know from our report, in fact, the last one was in January, about the growing levels of inequality globally. So I wouldn't bore you with that. You probably would see that on the right-hand side of your screen is a graph of the trend in terms of the decline of personal income tax across the world. West Africa, Africa is sitting somewhere in the middle there, and it's interesting because we saw a sharp decline, particularly from the late 80s and during the structural adjustment days, till it's kind of gradually kind of stabilized towards the till now. But we're seeing a change in trend in a number of countries in the region as we move into specifics. But I want to go, I think my real take today is to get back into the region and to give you a perspective from the region away from the global. So inequality in West Africa. So this is basically based also on our commitment to reduce inequality index, which I think Benedict put up in his earlier presentation. I won't bore you with what it is, because I suspect that everybody knows about it. It's a biannual index that Oxfam produces and kind of tries to measure the commitment of governments across the world in tackling inequality. We've done some improvements to the methodology, and three things I think worth mentioning is that we're measuring the commitment governments made, and then also the institutions and the impact of the commitments they've made as to whether it's actually reducing inequality or not. And so some of this information is essentially drawn out of that index, which we focused on. So we drilled from the global one and drilled into a regional one to just give us a sense of the levels of inequality. But I'm focusing on just the tax component and the contribution of tax to inequality in the region. So just coming down to West Africa, and as we indicated, that a tiny few essentially still retain quite a substantial wealth from the region over the last 3 years in particular. And so if we take the case of the region in Burkina Faso and Ghana, Mali, and Niger, and the wealthiest 0.1% hold close to 2 times as much wealth as the rest of the as much as the bottom 50% of the population. In Nigeria, it's actually even worse, in a sense that the 3 richest men own as much wealth as more than 83%, 83 million of the population. And Nigeria's population is close to 70% of the region's population. And so when Nigeria shifts in one direction, basically it pulls the rest of the region along. And we've seen from data also that their wealth has grown exponentially in the last 3 years since COVID hit. In terms of the progressivity of tax systems in the region, this particular slide, this one focuses, it's actually drawn from the Afrobarometer index, Afrobarometer measures the opinion of Africans periodically. And the latest one found that 71% of West Africans essentially would like the rich to be taxed far better than it is at the moment. And we know also that tax collection in the region is extremely low compared to even other parts of the continent. And then also from the index, we notice that tax policies are reducing inequality by just 2%, and that doesn't compare with Tanzania in East Africa, which is doing about 11% in terms of the contribution of tax to reducing inequality. Just to move to the next slide, and of course, as a result, you also have the region doing less than half of what a region like Southern Africa does in terms of how tax is contributing to reducing inequality. The slide and the diagram on the right is essentially the tax component of the index, and the bottom end of the countries. In fact, Liberia is 150 out of 157 countries. So the region does fairly poorly compared to the rest of the continent in using tax as an instrument to address inequality. But a few things are happening, and so at this point, I want to just quickly dive into some case studies just to give you the direction of some of the countries in terms of what they are doing to address this. And the case, the first case really it's that I refer to, it's Sierra Leone, and I just read the first part. So after the first major index published in 2018, in 2019 we published a regional index for West Africa. But in 2019 we had a discussion. We had a forum at the sidelines of the African Union with a number of countries, including Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, and Namibia. And the first statement here was the president's statement. That's the president of Sierra Leone. He had just been elected, I think just under a year. And he said, and I read this quickly, he says, let me say at the outset that Sierra Leone sees its 2018 ranking in Oxfam's commitment to reducing inequality index as an incentive to undertake further progressive action to address thorny development questions. And the other two are just again quotations from his speech. Now subsequent to that, we saw that as an entry point to be able to, based also on the index, to see what possibly we could support the country with in terms of addressing what the president had identified. And so one of the things we quickly identified with our colleagues in Sierra Leone and partners, it's that the country had, this scattered legislation around transfer pricing. So I won't go into the details in terms of the process, but just to say the outcome, and then maybe in the discussions one could speak to the process, because I think at some point one needs to understand how the process contributes to outcomes and the like. And so basically we along with our partners at the country level, but then also working with ATAF, that the African Tax Administrators Forum, supported Sierra Leone in developing a comprehensive transfer pricing regulation. And I do know that our friends from the IMF and the World Bank had opportunity to look at both the first and the second and the third drafts before it went to Parliament for passage into law, and of course the president has sent. And as we speak, it's been 2 years in implementation, and we've subsequently supported the implementing authorities, about 21 of them, with consistent capacity delivered essentially by ATAF in this respect. Again, as I said, during the question and answer time, I could take us through the process and how we kind of came to this outcome, which I think it's important, because subsequently we've seen other countries in the region ask for that sort of support. So the second case study, and I'll speak quickly just after this slide to how it's cascaded into kind of a regional piece of work along the lines of also transfer pricing regulation for West Africa. So the second case study comes from Burkina Faso, and you might be familiar with the situation in Burkina Faso at the moment. But before the crisis, the current crisis, CSOs mobilized basically to participate in the management of natural resources and to also benefit from the fiscal components of natural resources. And so CSOs mobilized behind a campaign known as the Gold Campaign, basically to help create a local fund for development. The French acronym is really FMDL. And the purpose of the framework of the fund essentially was to support and tackle some of the structural inequalities, particularly as Maya also indicated, education, social protection, and also healthcare, because education. And in fact, before the country's coup d'etat a year ago, Burkina Faso, the year before, was pushing as much as 23% of its tax revenue to funding education, which is far above, well, at least 3 points above the AU requirement, and also under the Abuja declaration, where African leaders agreed that at least they would spend 15% of their budget on healthcare, and also at least 20% on education. And as we speak, at least $1.7 million have been disbursed from this fund throughout the 13 administrative regions of the country. The situation has changed subsequently, but because of the change in government. But that's just to give you a sense of what's happened prior to the political change. And I think one other point I need to make is that we also supported working with our colleagues at the national level, kind of local level, set up piloted some local committees, basically to exercise oversight. Again, a bit about the process, exercise oversight at the national level, because I think it's not just simply useful to stay at the national and the legislative level, but how you accompany partners all the way to the local level to be able to monitor and ensure that the resources are actually tackling inequality as they deem it fit. The last point, which I want to link to the case study from Sierra Leone, is that as a result of also the work in Sierra Leone, ECOWAS has over the past 1.5 years been working on a regional transfer pricing regulation, drawn also in part from some of the lessons from Sierra Leone. And the last point I really need to talk about, which is something that ECOWAS and also UEMOA, the monetary union of the French-speaking countries in the region, have been working on, just came to a conclusion, the tax transition framework supported by the European Union. Basically, this country's trying to develop a new tax framework, basically to help kind of optimize domestic revenue. But the interesting thing is that some of the coalitions were built around some of these case studies I indicated, were supported to make input into this framework, because the framework essentially focused on, was heavy on VAT. And as we've seen in the region at the moment, as a result of the COVID crisis, we do know that the countries, all the 16 countries plus Mauritania in the region, are expected to cut at least their budgets by close to $69 billion in the next 4 to 5 years by 2026. And so the emphasis on VAT, it's regressive in many respects. And I think Maya towards the end made the point that indirect taxes can address inequality, but if the grants, social grants, are not available, they basically would, raise poverty. And I think that that's how we say it, that the VAT emphasis in a tax transition project would actually exacerbate inequality in the region, rather than trying to help address what we see as fundamental in terms of addressing the fundamental needs of the region, which we see in part as linked to some of the crises, particularly in the Sahel region, the issues of inequality. And so on this note, I would bring my presentation to a close. And if there's time, I'll speak to particularly the Sierra Leonean process and how we came to that particular outcome, which I think is a very important one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bang. That was very interesting and widening topic for all of us here. So we've gone a little bit out of time. We have got 25 minutes left for this Q&A session. So I would like to initiate it just now. As you can see, there's been a number of questions posted on the chat with some answers being brought. So one has been asked about why is it so difficult to factor in corporate income tax and export taxes? Isn't this a major caveat? There's an answer given to that, and maybe I don't know if it's Charles or Maya who responded to that, so you may want to express it. There are questions put to Maya with regards to the work on the Lorenz curve, so maybe we can come back to that a little bit as well. That would be certainly interesting. And I see that, Maya, you posted some answers and some links for our colleagues, so you'll be able to go through that. Again, some explainers about the case of VAT becoming progressive when you account for informality. So I think you'll take it up. Charles, you've got two questions here. I believe you received it as well from Stella on the formula and whether the size of the policy matters in the debate and the discussion, and recommendations with regards to your findings on the labor tax wage with respect to social contributions. There may be also discussions from our colleagues at E1 unit, Dominique and Benedict, sorry, and Xavier, with regards to the use of these different perspectives given to us from Oxfam, commitment to reduce inequality index, from the commitment to inequality by the CQ Institute, from the IMF perspective and the specific policy analysis that they do in the Article 4. They show also links to local development, decentralization, social protection, education, health, pension. In some cases, the IMF do a specific climate change policy analysis. So I think that's in this session, we see also the breadth of sectors also link to this fiscal policy analysis, both in terms of taxations and spending. And I think that links us back to what you do at E1 unit also with regards to budget support. So it could be interesting to enlighten a little bit the colleagues on that, and how you suggest to use all of these perspectives in their analysis to prepare sector reform contracts, for example. Then we may have a quick word by the IMF on the importance of revenue administration reform to make sure that this fiscal setup actually works as it's supposed to work. So shall I start giving the floor to Maya before giving it to Charles and Benedict and Xavier, perhaps? Is that okay?
Sure, yeah. Thank you. And thanks for the great questions. They're really good. So the first question I had was, can I explain how the VAT can become progressive if you account for informality? Which is a lovely question. So I'm going to just briefly share my screen again, if I can. Is that okay, Jerome? I think it's going to stop you sharing, but
no, definitely you can share your screen.
Okay, great. So
let's just try to keep it to about 5 minutes so everyone has the time to answer the questions. They will have another round.
Will do, absolutely.
Thank you.
So if you just take a look at this graph on the right-hand side here, this shows the share of total consumption, which comes from an informal place of purchase. And you can see that it's higher for the poorer deciles than it is for the richer deciles. And so what this means is that if informality is high enough, and this is the case of Cote d'Ivoire here, I think, if informality is high enough, then we see that we can actually end up having a progressive VAT. So that's just to answer the first question. The second question was asking whether or not I could whether or not the CQ can do kind of similar sorts of analysis for other types of grants. So here's just an example of,
Oh, you want to share your screen? Sorry, go
yes,
back.
sorry. Here's just an example of the type of thing that we can show. So this is very similar to the concentration curves, but these are concentration shares. So this shows what percentage of the grant goes to the first decile, the second decile, etc. So you can see here that for grants, it's very pro-poor. We see a much larger share going to the poorer decile than to the richer decile. But if you look at, for example, education, it's much flatter. So this is the sort of thing that we would do in a CEQ all the time. And if we don't show these graphs, then we'll instead show kind of the Kwakwani index or concentration coefficient, which will be just a summary statistic of the same thing. So definitely, you should be able to find that information in any CEQ assessment which is done. And then the final question was around corporate taxes and why it is that we can't allocate them. So the basis of what a CEQ does is based on a household survey. And we look at households in a survey and we say, okay, what income do you report having? And therefore we calculate your income tax based on the income reported. When it comes to corporate income tax, they're not represented in a household survey. And so we're unable to link sort of corporate business profits to a household in order to determine how much a household might pay in corporate income tax. So it's kind of a fundamental limitation of household surveys. Sometimes household surveys do include a little bit of information, like does this household have a business, a subsistence farming business or something like that. And in that case, we do sometimes calculate some corporate tax, but it's very, it's usually quite limited what we can calculate. So yeah, it's a big limitation of the CEQ. I think that's it for my questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. And maybe we can direct colleagues again to the link that you posted for finding your work here on the website. But you may want to post a link that people will be able to find on the platform later on. Charles and Brooks, do you want to come in now? And
yes,
I ask all colleagues to put on the video so that we see each other's as we talk.
Right. Thank you, Jérôme. Thank you for the very nice questions, the two questions. So let me try and address them quickly. On the formula slide, what I showed is actually, no, it doesn't include transfers. It's really an analysis of tax policy. Think of the PIT, which is really an important instrument for redistribution on the tax policy side in isolation. But of course, as Maya showed us, and transfers obviously matter a lot in redistribution, right? We, in our TA work on tax policy, we support the VAT, for example. VAT is a major instrument for collecting tax revenue in many countries. It's indispensable, and of course, one way to look at the VAT as a potential redistributive instrument is that it can fund redistributive policy on the expenditure side, and this is absolutely essential to look at VAT from that angle. The second question on the labor tax wedge, yes, that's very nice. Thank you for this very nice question. Very important. Yeah, we think that progressivity is needed, right? So progressivity applies on the PIT. We talk about labor income here, but it should apply to social security contributions too. And really what you want to avoid is a situation where you have a higher rate of social security contributions on the lowest incomes. that's really not what you want. It is sending a very harmful incentives to the economy, and it discourages entry into the formal labor market. So yes, you really want progressivity in both tax policy and, as much as possible, social security contributions. Now we can go further depending on the broader country context. As you know, in many countries, a good number of countries, we have tax credit, what we call in-work earned tax credit, where you want to encourage a formal effort on a formal labor effort by rewarding, increasing your labor income by actually giving a tax credit to up to a certain level of income, and that also can be important when you realize that to enter the formal labor market, some people may have to give up on benefits they get when they're not formally employed, right? So that also can be a very powerful instrument to ensure progressivity, right, on the labor market. Let me stop here. We can go on forever, but I think we don't have time. Thank you.
No, we still have a few minutes, but I would like to give the floor to Brooks, who raised his hands to add information before we give the floor to other colleagues.
Thank you very much. Just to echo what Charles said, and also the other presenters mentioned, it's very much you need to use fiscal policy both on the revenue side and also on the expenditure side to achieve the maximal redistribution impact. I just shared a paper in the chat which discusses this, and there was another question on revenue administration reform, and this is part and parcel with this entire effort. So you might have the best designed expenditure and tax policies. However, if you're at the end of the day not actually collecting the revenue, then, and this is what Charles showed in his presentation, and in some countries the tax base is quite low. You not have very much yield or many resources to redistribute, for example, via social benefit transfers and other measures. I'll end with that. Thank you.
Okay, I found back my microphone. Thank you very much for those. Before we ask perhaps Benedict or Xavier to come in with a view on how to use this complementary analysis that have been proposed to us today, and how to understand that in the context of the interventions by the EU at sector reforms, budget support, perhaps we can ask Mr. Obank, which factors do you see as essential for public debate, for embracing better or more equitable fiscal policies? And how can this be reinforced from your point of view through work with international NGOs and local CSOs?
Well, thanks. I mean, I think the first thing is, one, to make a connection between fiscal policy and people's basic needs, so inequality. And we've seen that in our work, that when you just simply handle fiscal policy on its own, you basically disengage from the rest of society. And so I think it's important to find a convergence, and so that you can carry people along with you. And that's how we've seen the progress. And I think also in DRM projects by international institutions, I think it's important to factor the civil society, other non-state actors, including in the private sector, because I think that private sector would want, for example, basic services for their workers and for their clients or customers. And therefore, if they are in better health condition, they are more likely to patronize their services and the like. So finding that connection to the larger society, it's important for the uptake of fiscal policies. And then also it gives and empowers citizens to challenge and to help monitor those processes. But I think also, because I think historically it's been focused on just simply the state. So that's, I think, one of the things that I think that it will be useful for us to pay attention to, that relationship between the kind of the macro level as well as in between meso and micro level relationships, so that it allows the state also to take into account, or the policy makers or the authorities to take into account the specificities of the citizens in terms of what their aspirations are. And I think, so as I said earlier, we've seen, a hike in VAT rates. Questions people are asking, for example, across at least West Africa, as to what use is that if we're going to pay so much. But if people can see the connection that actually it's going to be invested in A, B, C, D to address their fundamental needs, then I think people will be more willing for improvement or adjustment of the fiscal regime. And I think, yeah, that's really, I think, the addition that I would just bring to this. I'm not quite sure if I fully addressed the question you raised, because I think there were 2 or 3 layered. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm putting back my microphone.
Okay.
I think we should really ask the participants to let us know what they want to keep hearing about or keep asking about. But I also would like to give the floor back to our colleagues at E1 unit, also to bring in their views.
Right. No, I think, thanks, Jerome, and I think that was extremely rich. I mean, just to perhaps, let's say, trying to put it together from, let's say, rather practical perspective. I mean, there is many colleagues here from delegations also, and I mean, it's your daily business. But perhaps just to as a reminder, I mean, I think the richness, or let's say the one of the strengths, and that was actually confirmed by the Collect More, Spend Better evaluation, which we are about to have finalized, is, let's say, the different instruments we are having in delegations. And I think let's say the art is really to combining those different elements. I mean, all the people, I mean, also the partners we have invited, and thanks for having accepted. I mean, we work with them. I mean, the IMF Revenue Mobilization Trust Fund, Managing Natural Resource Wealth Trust Funds, we are a major contributor. So through that work, I think, and we also very much encourage always to have kind of those missions linked up with, let's say, local public finance management, donor group meetings, to have this exchange on the ground and being really country specific. Through CUQ, we through our actually the inequalities unit, there were some CQ studies co-funded in the past. We are also looking at how we can continue this work, but obviously also through TCFs from the delegation side, it's something which can be done. And I think it's this type of analysis which then can be used in terms of trying to, put certain issues or let's say influencing the debate or putting issues on the table. I mean, of course, in terms of budget support, we always depend on the partner country. I mean, we can never force an issue. What we can do is try to use analytical tools to kind of encourage discussions and to link up with the civil society. We also have the opportunity to use civil society calls for proposals, which then would be, let's say, independent and and through that angle try to influence the debate. I mean, we've had an interesting discussions also with the LAC region in terms of how we can perhaps use in a future program that element of let's say call for proposals and civil society input. I mean, just to give you one example, I mean, Jérôme, you mentioned sector reform contracts. I mean, in Cameroon, there was, for example, an issue in primary education, the question of school books, and they were like 3 times the price than, you know, in the region. And, you know, analyzing this showed that, you know, it's basically very few publishing houses. They have almost a monopoly or oligopoly. The procurement was, you know, was very problematic. So, I mean, things can also be addressed from that. I mean, like, something kind of basic as school books actually had a very strong public finance management dimension. I mean, that was actually a priority also for the World Bank in the country. I don't know, Xavier is also in the call, if you want to also share any experience from your perspective.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. So I don't think I would have anything really smart to say after those great presentations. Maybe 2 messages I would kind of take away is, and I know that many colleagues from delegations are connected, is that this is really something for all of us. It's not because we are the economists or there are economists in the EU delegation that it should be those dealing with those graphs and so on. I think we saw that today, that this really, when we screen policy, that we should have this inequality lens, and that David can be in the details, as you mentioned, the fees and so on. So definitely something that shouldn't be kind of parked for people who like numbers. And I think reading a budget, trying to get into the below the surface, try to see what are the kind of distortions in that, should be for all of us in all sectors. And the other message is that we talk about fiscal policy, but obviously it's a lot of fiscal politics. And in trying together with the IMF, the CSO, or the organizations to move some lines, we need to be realistic. There are vested interests and so on. So it's also, when we try to look at the perfect solution on the graph, it's nice, but obviously we'll need to target the second or third best, I mean, in the reality. So just 2 kind of messages I'm taking away. Thank you.
Thank you very much.